education and student assignment, and Matt has also served on education and school discipline related advisory boards for the Council of State Governments and other agencies. Also with us is William Rodriguez. He is an assistant professor and chair of juvenile justice and youth advocacy at Wheelock College. He's been in the criminal and juvenile justice arena for 30 years, and he serves on a number of local and national boards related to the issues of juvenile justice and youth advocacy and reform. And Rochelle is with us as well. Rochelle Bennett is an associate commissioner of student and family support at the Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, and she oversees several programs and initiatives designed to support student success. And she's also very passionate about youth leadership, she told me before we started. So that's our panelists. They're going to be speaking in this order. They'll present a little bit, and as I said, we'll ask questions, and then we'll open it up for questions from you as well. Now, this is a living room, so we are hoping to have really an engaged dialogue with all of you as well. So Matt, we can go first.
So if this were my living room, I think I'd probably so it's such a pleasure to be here with this group. I wish you guys were hanging out in my living room all the time, especially to have Russ Skiba and to bring this. Where Russ left it with us standing at a crossroads is the piece that resonates with me so much, because this is, as an issue of the school to prison pipeline, is something that we've seen tremendous change in the last dozen years, in the last 30 years, right? Yeah, 30 years. School discipline today looks a heck of a lot different than it probably did for most of you when you were a student, okay? It's something where maybe the hallways look the same, the desks look the same, some of the books look the same, but that doubling of the out-of-school suspension rate that we've seen has decimated, right, the educational futures of so many of our youth. And when we look at who that affects and where that affects, and in the heart of our communities of color, right, particularly for our young men, these are the first students who are harmed by these policies. And with that, though, we've also seen this tremendous turning of tides as a nation on this issue. We saw such dramatic change in the Obama administration era in terms of federal and national attention to these issues. But the thing that really strikes me most, and where I really draw from Russ's lecture and from his body of research, is that, you know, both nationally and here in Massachusetts, the reasons that we've been seeing change on these issues is we found ways for parents and students and educators and advocates of all stripes, pain in the butt attorneys like me, to speak with one voice on these issues. And that's what pushed people forward. And that's why when we have people who, together with Dan Wilson, who have really godfathered this field of research, have done it in a way that is in plain language and is immediately accessible to me as an advocate, to the parent organizers that we've worked with and that have sat down at the table with you, to the students, to the educators. That's how we're able to do this work together. And here in Massachusetts, that's no different. And if I could look beyond the first two rows with these bright lights, I'm sure I'd be able to see more people than Jennifer DeBarros, who's taken this on as a parent in New Bedford, and Nima Avasia, who's taken this on as a teacher just up the street at the McCormick Middle School, and Mark Warren, who's done this as a sociologist to tell the stories of these parents and students who have organized around this issue. In Massachusetts, we have seen the beginning of this turning of the tide, but what happens next for us at this crossroads is what's most critical. When Massachusetts passed a new law to change the way we handle discipline in schools, Chapter 222, it did it for all the right reasons. Back when that law was passed, about 64% of our out-of-school suspensions in the state were not for guns or drugs or violence or even bullying, but for what the state itself categorized as non-violent, non-criminal, non-drug related behaviors. And it was within this catch-all and far more subjective category that we saw the greatest racial disparities as a state. And so we have the right reasons to change our laws. And in it, we have a law that does a lot of good things. It provides more due process protections for parents and students. It requires, as Russ said, that even if a student is suspended, they have the right to make academic progress. It requires that with each disciplinary incident, you push to consider ways to re-engage the student in learning. And before things build up to something as big as a long-term suspension, that you demonstrate that you've tried alternatives to suspension to address these things. And thanks to folks like Rochelle, it's caused us as a state to collect and look at the data and the disparities that we see and figure out ways to address it. But all of these reforms are only so helpful, as Russ said, if our schools are given the support they need to implement them. When I was a teacher, the only professional development I got around school discipline was not to smile until November, right? So we have this moment as a state where we are doing the right things on paper, by law, and also by consensus. But if we can't come together and support each other as educators and advocates and parents and students in doing this, we're going to struggle. And so with my 0-minute sign up, I need to flag one way that that's happening so beautifully here. And I don't know if anybody from BSAC is in the room, but the Boston Student Advisory Council knows that if they're going to make sure their peers, these high school leaders from across Boston Public Schools, if their peers know what their disciplinary rights are, the first place they're going to check is on their phone. So they created the world's first, the nation's first school discipline smartphone app to make sure you know what your rights are so that you can advocate for yourself, which is something we want all of our high school students to learn in the first place. And so that we can make sure that everybody knows what the rules are and can be on the same page at the same time. And it's in those opportunities where I feel like we can move this work forward together as communities and as a state.
Thank you. Thank you. Willie.
Hello, everyone. Buenas tardes. Buenas tardes.
Buenas tardes.
Thank you. Makes me feel embraced, welcome as a Latino, right? We live to embrace. And that's what I always teach also parents and teachers, that in order to become culturally responsive and sensitive, and maybe to the extent that you become proficient and competent, that it just takes a few little body language movements, a smile, a welcome to embrace these young people that are given to you by families to be able to be educated in a place that they feel safe. And the first starts with the greeting. And I say that because most of my work, and now I'm into that sort of Dr. Skiba mode, intellectual scholar, because I always was prefacing my commentaries with my colleagues here earlier, and I said, I was one of those kids who sometimes teachers felt that my mannerisms, because I spoke with a lot of my hands, were too violent. So I got an interpretation of that. Because I spoke with an accent, or maybe I said a few Spanish words in between, they assumed that I was thinking in Spanish, so I couldn't write well in English. And I always say that being Puerto Rican, right, does not make me an expert in the 26 subcultures that make our Latino community. We all have our differences and nuances and idiosyncrasies. And I say that because it's very important as we face this dilemma of English language learning students, immigrant students coming into our schools, particularly the prevalence of it in our Boston public schools. And we're having these issues of language being construed as learning disabilities, that while we dismantle a law, transitional bilingual education in Massachusetts, because we bought into an UNS referendum that took a well-run, well, at least a configured bilingual education law that did the best to develop our children, but maybe administrative bureaucratically it wasn't working as efficiently. We dismantle it through this sort of xenophobic mentality that to learn English, you could take about a year to learn it and master it. And what we created was a high level of dropout rates at the 9th grade level, ELL students. We were misinformed, including our own communities who felt that that was the best interest to vote for that referendum. And what we have is this issue called the school to prison pipeline. We looked at the data, and right now everything nationally is being construed. We're going even further in our advocacy to look at it from the cradle to prison. And like I said, we were in the comments about my background. I've been in 30 years in this business called criminal justice, and now I'm in the juvenile justice arena, because I believe that after running alternative to incarceration programs, after representing people who were going into prison, I feel that if you look at discipline, and we have to really, really challenge this notion of what we feel is the best method of educating our children. I don't think we should have even the word discipline, except when it comes to focusing your academic work. Be disciplined in what you're producing, because if you use discipline and you start creating the deans and titling it and giving it credence, then we're going to always be in that punishment mode. And in a country that we incarcerate 2.3 million people, #1 in the world, we won the Super Bowl of that, right? But look at the outcome and the impact of it. I always say one child in jail is one day too many. Because I've always talked to families who are affected and impacted by our decisions. And we talk about racial and ethnic disparities, which Dr. Skibba noted in his thing, which I have a colleague, Lindsay Heffernan here, who's working in our juvenile justice sector, and she runs the JDAI alternative, which is looking at racial and ethnic disparities. The impact of your decision when you have that child to suspend and expel them will be that four-walled cell. That cost us about $150,000 or $200,000 to build one jail cell. It costs us $52,000 to $75,000 to annually house an inmate in our jails. And it only costs us $9,000 to $15,000 on the average to educate a child. You do the math. You do the math. For me, those are the realities. And when I hear Miss Matthews, who lives in New Orleans, who was affected by the Katrina hurricane, and she lived in the Lower Acre, who had a child who was, because they had a learning disability and because he had a behavioral anger issue because his father wasn't present in his home, so he was taking it out a lot on people, a teacher construed that behavior as adverse violent, brought in the security guards, officers, and police, and he ended up in the Tallulah juvenile prison in Louisiana, which was considered at one time in Louisiana the worst juvenile prison in this country. So the ramifications of our decisions in this discipline approach leads to the kinds of things that hurt families and hurt our children. And we have to create a system, a paradigm shift in our thinking that no matter what challenges that child brings you, they all can learn. They all can learn. Failure and difficulty are feedback, to coin an Efficacy Institute training model, the growth mindset. You get smarter using effective effort. You get smarter by believing these children, and you avoid that senseless piece of pushing them out so they end up in the system that we should be running out of business, is our criminal justice system. So that's what I put as a challenge out to you, and I will wait for the questions and concerns and inquiries that come out of that. So looking forward to that.
Thank you.
Michelle, thank you. So what we've heard tonight is compelling, and it's a great concern. There's also some promise in some of the interventions that have been mentioned, and clearly a need to conduct further research and explore this further. I'm going to share with you some of the approaches that the Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education have undertaken with schools and districts. So related to the Chapter 222 state law, as well as federal IDEA requirements, the department now annually identifies schools and districts based on their rates of removal, suspension, and expulsion, and based on their rates of long-term suspension, as well as disproportionate suspensions related to race and ethnicity and disability status. So this past June, we decided to create a professional learning network, and we invited our 31 identified districts that were identified at either the school and or district level and asked them to participate with us in this learning community, because we don't feel like we have all the answers or anyone does, and that we need to learn together. So we have engaged schools to learn with and from each other, as well as from others in this arena, and engage them so that the department can learn how can we be helpful over time to the cohorts with which we work, as well as to the broader community. One of the requirements of Chapter 222 is that all school principals in the state periodically reflect on and analyze their student discipline data, inclusive by selected populations, and to determine locally whether changes in practice are needed. So with our professional learning network, we are requiring an action plan that is being submitted to us in 2 phases. One focused on efforts this year, one focused on plans for next year. And we really have a goal of not telling schools and districts simply stop suspending or don't suspend at all, but rather to take the approach that is more positive than punitive, rather to say, what are our expectations as a community? How can we engage staff and students and family in setting those clear expectations and teaching about them, and then responding to challenging behavior in appropriate and helpful ways that can be a learning experience for the students and the adults. Learning about strategies, learning about what supports might be needed, and so forth. So we have some data that schools and districts have shared with us to date to say that they've seen progress compared with prior years. We don't yet have the data from this school year, the first school year with this professional learning network. We'll have that after it's submitted to the department this summer. But we're looking forward to learning more. I can give you a few examples of some of the efforts underway in some of these participating schools and districts. And some of it is reflective of what you've heard today is some promising practices or research and evidence-based practices. So we have a number of schools and districts that have undertaken PBIS or restorative practices. We have schools and districts that have decided to no longer have suspension, being out of class, be a consequence for missing class time, like cutting, skipping, truancy. And we've had them we've had some schools and districts think about what are alternatives to the suspension, and what are alternative ways to provide supports and preventative efforts and de-escalation training and strategies for all staff, and partnerships with community providers, police, and others, so that all students can be in school, engaged in learning as much as possible. So one last comment is that we are aiming to do this at the state and local level in a way that isn't siloed and isolated. So it's not, here's a rethinking discipline effort, but how can this be undertaken in a context of creating safe and supportive learning environments, and how can efforts be integrated into broader needs and assessments and activities that ultimately will help all students be prepared to be successful in school and after school.
Thank you. I think I would just like to start it by maybe stepping back a little bit and wondering how exactly did we get here to this dramatic change in discipline? And Russ, I think I want to ask you this. 20 to 30 years ago, we didn't see these kind of suspension rates, and we certainly didn't have police officers in so many schools and everything else. So really, what was the thinking? I mean, I understand that there was a war on drugs, we had super predator kids, and we had all kinds of fear going on in the country at that time, but the schools bought in, right? So what was happening, and how did we get to this point where discipline has become such an issue?
Well, as you said, zero tolerance grew out of the war on drugs. as early as say 1982, 30-some sailors were suspended from a work on a submarine for having a trace amount of marijuana in their lockers, and even at that time, the captain of the ship said, "How am I going to sail this ship without sailors?" So there was criticism even from the very first, but it was picked up by the Reagan administration. They used it to you could have your boat that you used for water skiing be impounded and sent to federal court as much as a major drug dealer at that time. The policy was discontinued when the one sailor was found on the Woods Hole oceanographic vessel, and that was impounded. But as you said, schools picked this up, and it was, I think, an effective soundbite. Pedro Noguera said, if you don't really know what to do, and schools that were feeling like they didn't know what to do about violence, which, by the way, there was this strong fear of violence in school increasing. There was increased community violence, but there was never any evidence of increase in school violence. But Pedro said, if you don't know what to do, then it's good to have sound bites that make it sound like you know what to do. So that's really the way the policy got momentum. It was picked up, I think, as a good soundbite for politicians at that time. But it's interesting to me. We talk about the effect of Columbine, and
Right.
It was very interesting that we saw some increase in the use of more negative procedures, more presence of police, more use of zero tolerance. But we also saw the beginnings of a movement that pushed back and said, "Wait a minute, there isn't really research going on here that supports this. We don't really know that this is working." We saw a lot of that have its beginnings at that point, and that, I think, led to movements that really became more widely supported in the late early 2000s, with the Breaking Schools Rules report, with the Discipline Disparities Collaborative, with good efforts by such organizations as the Lawyers Committee and LDF. So we've reached a point where that is still there, but fortunately we have really good advocates out there as well that are putting some pressure to continue to roll back those policies that hurt kids.
I'm wondering, Matt, you mentioned the 64% rate of where we were prior to 22 in Massachusetts.
Yeah.
What is it now? Like, how did that affect the suspension rate here in Massachusetts? What do we know about it? And where's the weakness, do you think?
Sure. So our out-of-school suspension rates have dropped, and they dropped particularly in the first year of implementation for those Category 18, nonviolent, non-criminal, non-drug-related behaviors. They still comprise about half of our out-of-school suspensions as a state, however. What was promising about the first year of implementation of Chapter 222 was that we saw across the board drops in out-of-school suspension rate for students of all races, for English language learners, for students with disabilities, for students of a lower socioeconomic status. And most promising, the drop in suspension rate was faster for Black and Latino students than white students, right? So the students who were being most targeted and were feeling the brunt of these practices, per a report from our friends at Massachusetts Appleseed. Julia is here tonight. And where we stand concerned now, right, is that we're in the third year of implementation. Thanks to a very responsive State Department of Education, we have data from the last school year and have had the time to look at it. And while our rates have stayed the same roughly as a state, we're starting to see those disparities that we hoped would keep shrinking start to increase again. And they're increasing most in some of our major cities. Holyoke had been suspending 1 in every 5 students before the law. That dropped down to 5% out of school suspension rate. That's since doubled, right? So we're in this bumpy spot where we as a state said, okay, we're gonna stop doing this, right? And I think we probably cut away some of the unnecessary suspensions, but we're struggling. to make sure that this law is properly implemented, that our educators are supported in doing it. And what we fear is the calls that we get and folks like Elizabeth McIntyre get where the parent says, they keep telling me to pick up my son. They keep calling me to pick up my son, and it doesn't show up as a suspension, which means it doesn't get tracked in the data that Rochelle uses, which means that the parent doesn't get the due process protections they need to make sure that their child keeps learning.
If I'm an educator, maybe I'm saying, you know what, I have a balance here.
Yeah.
I have a responsibility to
Mhm.
all students, not just the students who are causing or disrupting things.
Yeah.
And I have a lot of other things on my plate,
Yeah.
right? I mean, I'm
Sure.
sure you've heard this, right? So I have to remove that student from the classroom because I've got 30 other kids here who need an education. So what do you say to that educator?
Well,
I'm hoping I'm speaking for someone out there
Yeah,
tonight, but
no.
there's a balance and there's professional development that needs to be done. Are those things accompanying the changes that we want to make here
I
in
mean,
this?
that's ultimately our concern, right? That our educators feel the support they need to make that change, because the transition from a zero tolerance based approach to one in which every disciplinary consequence warrants discretion, right? Warrants consideration of, is this in the best interest of the student, right? Is a big change. And we could look at the research, and our friend Bria Perry has done enough research that I think we could call it the class clown theory, right? Which means that once you kick out one student of class, the next behavioral challenge is going to pop up, right? Like, I might have been the first class clown, but if I was kicked out, somebody else is going to step into that role right after. And so we know that in terms of effective classroom management, some of the things that we've relied on actually haven't proved effective, right? And suspension is perhaps the biggest one that's made us concerned. And so the key is, when we know we have practices now that work to address and reduce racial disparities if done with fidelity, and have worked in districts that are harder and more cash strapped than ours, we have to figure out ways to redouble our efforts and make sure everybody feels like they can move that work forward.
Michelle, maybe you can respond a little bit to that too as well. What do we do to support teachers to be able to do some of this and make what's really a profound change, I think, in thinking and how people discipline? Is there support for teachers to be able to do this?
Yeah, I think you bring up a very important point. And I think that we've heard from schools and districts that this is, the crux of one part of the challenge of this work, is how to help teachers be able to prevent some of the challenging behavior and de-escalate when it starts, as well as identify when there may be other kinds of supports that are needed, whether they be mental health or other types of services that might be able to be provided. And we've heard from administrators as well that there's some shifting in practices. So rather than having a standard practice of teachers sending students out of the class when there's an issue, rather help the teachers be able to handle it in class wherever possible and have people come into the class when needed as well to help, when possible, keep the students there. Or if they need to step out of class to get some type of supports or cool down, that there's some vehicle for them to do that other than them being suspended or thrown out, so that there's a place for them, for the students to get what they need and then return as soon as possible to the classroom environment.
I read an essay not too long ago, and we had reposted it on our website at WBUR just today, actually, and it was about a principal who engages in corporal punishment of students. This apparently is allowed in some states, and he paddles students when they misbehave, and he thinks that this is okay. He actually thinks it's better for students. So I think that in a way, a lot of these disciplinary procedures are reflective of an attitude, and you touched upon this a little bit, Willie, right? It's a very profound attitude of what we think about punishment, what we think about behavior, what we think about students. And I want you to talk about, if you can, how we address that. Because, we can have all the policies, right, that we want, and we can have all the data that we want, but there's something there's a profound bias and there's a profound attitude about how we deal with these issues that really is the crux of this, right? So what do we do?
Well, well, like I said before, it's an attitude. It's also a psychology, right? So if we think that we can modify behavior or teach a lesson, we tend to go immediately to punishment, right? Discipline is the word we use, but then it can go into punishment. And this is one of the things we battle. Like I said before, when I talked about the prison system, prison industrial complex, it's a profit-making business. It's we make more money out of punishing people. In America, we make money out of punishing people. You can't even, like I said before, you can't double park without being cited, right?
That's right.
We have a budget crisis, so we increase our citations. Arrests in this country are going down, right? And so you have a tough on crime attitude, and yet if crime is going down, right, but arrests are going up, what is justifying the arrest? You have a shortfall somewhere. And if we're going to give teachers support, we got to not only give them professional development, but we have to put money, because a lot of these policies we institute are unfunded mandates. They get lost in translation. Part of the problem is that when we talk about creating disciplinary policies, or even policies which is says use expulsion and suspension as a last resort, we normally do not put the training and orientation that it takes. These are longitudinal exercises that also require us adults to develop our mindset, that we're open. So I take to the teacher that may feel that one person is the behavioral issue. Well, the responsibility of the teacher is to teach every child, not just the 29 that are not giving them problems. We did this when we imposed really these conditions under the MCAS standards of proficiency. So teach to the test. And if you're going to be evaluated by it, and a teacher in making their most benevolent, well-intended approach is saying, I got to teach the test now because I got to take those 29 students and get them to the proficiency level. I'm going to try to push this one out because they're not going to get me up to speed, because I'm going to be evaluated by all the 30 of them. So I'm making a decision that I have power and control. And this is an issue of power and control. When you use punishment and discipline, it becomes your default for your negligence and failure to want to do your job to teach that child. And that includes not only teachers, I'm talking about administrators and parents and everything. We often use discipline, which is our psychology, to control a certain behavior that we think it's going to improve their ability to re-engage and feel good about learning and about doing social activities. And we have a dropout issue. So how do you re-engage all of those that we drop out back into an environment where they see going through metal detectors, they see police searching them? So even students themselves, young people have told me straight out from the street and straight at the ones that I've seen in the system, and I've interviewed in prisons and in detention facilities, they said, why should I go back to a school that's going to treat me less than? In New Orleans, every young Black youth that you talk to there has a belief system that they're either going to die by the time they get to 18 years old or get arrested. That's almost a self-fulfilling prophecy. When you have a system that has an attitude that gives up on these kids because of the context of their color or their gender or their ethnicity or their orientation, then we have a problem. Now, what's the solution to that? Yes, you can build as much awareness and control, but it's really hitting people where it counts. Look at the impact that your decision has over that child eventually. We've done more to do disincentives of educating young people than we do more of motivating them to learn. So I challenge everyone, and and even if I don't have all the answers I want, but I've seen enough to be passionate and frustrated and almost angry. Anger is good because it changes my those realities to a real positive advocacy reform agenda that I hope that gets the people that I want to.
It looks like we have some folks with questions. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, thank you, Russell.
Could you just step up a little bit closer to the mic? Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Russell Skiba, for the presentation. I really appreciated it. And to the living room panel, getting cozy there. But I wanted to speak to the educator piece. I'm an educator in the Boston Public Schools, very proud of being a teacher in the Boston Public Schools. And I wanted to pick up on the way forward from Russell Skiba's presentation. And I want to talk about resources for the educators. Boston has just cut millions from its budget, and I'm angry. I'm a union activist, and in my school, I see teachers, most teachers, not all, but most teachers dedicated to PBIS, we're a PBIS school in Boston. We give up our lunch, after school, before school to support students. I have kids, now it's MCAS, so I have kids coming down to, I'm a pre-K teacher, coming down to my classroom to just kind of gather themselves after the horrendous MCAS that they've had to take. What we don't have as support staff, we need, it takes money to do this, as was pointed out earlier. I want that prison money. I want that prison money because that's what it takes. You can be the most professional, I consider myself very professional and very qualified teacher. I used to do work with at-risk before I became a teacher, at-risk kids. You need counselors, social workers. You need more than just, so that's my point. Second, what I would like to ask is DESE collecting data on classroom pushouts? Not school pushouts, but classroom pushouts. Because sometimes kids, I've seen this in other schools, get pushed out of the classroom with a volunteer to teach them, and they're the most challenging kids. So is there data on classroom pushouts rather, because that's a form of isolation, social isolation and intellectual isolation.
Okay.
So the DESE, I had one. What is higher education doing? Because I don't think higher education is preparing teachers to teach in an urban public school. They're prepared to teach in a suburban, but not urban or rural.
Okay, that's a lot of questions. First, we're going to ask Rochelle about the collecting of data, and then about support money for districts. What do we know about that?
Okay, so not enough is the answer to that question, but I don't think that the department collects the kind of push out data that you're speaking to. There's certain kinds of data that the department collects in terms of educational setting and in terms of whether there's this particular incident and the disciplinary or associated results. But that most of that data, I believe, is at the local level that needs to be analyzed and reflected upon. In terms of resources, unfortunately, the new requirements related to Chapter 222, it didn't provide additional resources at either the state or local level. So sort of collectively across the board and on many related topics, we really need to see what are the low cost options and what resources can we find available, whether it be through partnerships in terms of perhaps training that can be offered to teachers, in terms of what are some practices that can be undertaken that don't cost the kind of money that like wide scale training would cost, and how to take advantage of peer learning across staff and teachers or across districts. I think it will be a continual challenge to consider how to best meet the needs and to move this work forward.
And Willie, in terms of
The
also
higher
higher
ed-
education,
the higher ed
yeah,
piece,
and training
as
teachers.
you make a great point, because one of my pet peeves is the way we're preparing the people we want to make the difference out there with. So we really have to start with challenging also our higher ed institutions around taking away also the traditional pedagogy of educational academic training that goes on. We have to filter more creativity around developing teachers that understand cultural competency, cultural proficiency, language, everything from bilingual, another language instruction, creativity around developing those skill sets at the higher ed level, because we're going to throw them into these sectors. They need to know and understand that the dynamic in urban schools is different than a suburban school, that there are a lot of issues concerning school and pseudo prison when it comes to rural, suburban, and urban, but all those sectors create different types of idiosyncrasies and challenges for teachers. So I think teacher preparation is one way to attack the problem, because if you can train them earlier, they're better prepared to deal with these sectors and deal with the changes. And we have to bring them to the classroom. So while they're in training, they need to be shadowed, they be to be shadowing you and be mentored by those teachers that they expect to be and who do best by teaching all our students in every cultural context that they're in. So I think that higher ed is very central to this dynamic rather than just collecting research, because research can be put on a shelf, but we need to put this in practice. And how do we develop the practice and approaches that Dr. Skiba is demonstrating here by the challenges he's posing by his research? We have to do better at using that research to also train our future teachers and our future people who are going to be in these sectors that affect this problem.
And we don't just tell them like Matt, don't smile until November, right?
Yeah, that's true.
Bit more,
By the
right?
way, if they would have suspended me every day for smiling. And by the way, I wanted to add to Matt's comment on chapter 222. While we now understand the reductions in exposures and suspensions, there's another practice going on in schools. And that is that they're in-house detaining, suspending. So they're putting them in rooms. And when you look at those rooms and you pass by them, because this has been testimony by teachers themselves, they see the students of color inside those rooms. So they're using a different methodology of detaining and suspending. But even though you don't throw them out of school, they're not necessarily learning.
But part of 222 is also supposed to make sure that the student is
That's
making
where the
academic
vigilance comes in,
progress,
because you
right.
have to, again, it gets lost in translation. So you have to be vigilant over that process as well.
But do you want to explain that a little bit, Rochelle? I mean, part of 222 says the student is supposed to also get an education if they do have to have some sort of alternative, right?
Right, right. So chapter 222 makes some distinctions between sort of short-term and long-term suspension, in school and out of school suspension. The data that the department looks at includes any suspensions or removals that are, again, if it's in school, it's more than half a day, or if it's out of school, it's for any portion of the day. But there are some different parameters in terms of some of the requirements related to the due process. So, you know, some of it might be oral versus written kind of communication, but certainly all of them are taken seriously within the law. And it's the expectation that schools will be considering different options and what would best meet the needs of the student. But all of those kinds of suspensions are in the realm.
But Willie brings up a good point. If there's not oversight, right? What happens if a district suspension rate goes up? Or if there are a lot of kids in a room somewhere with a volunteer and their educational needs aren't being met, what happens to that district? Are there certain courses of action that have to be taken? I would assume there are, right?
Right. So it can play out in a number of ways. I think if there are complaints brought to the attention of the department about specific violations or in compliance, then the department looks into those and has a sort of a structured process to look into those and determine whether there's non-compliance findings or not and corrective action needed. In general, in terms of the data that's actually reported to the department, we do these now annual identifications so that those that have the highest rates would be sort of basically identified and asked to submit action plans. So that is part of the consequences as well.
Is that on them? Is it self-reported by the school?
Yes.
And so they have to make also the things of race and ethnicity? Do they have to do that back
Yes.
breakdown as well?
Yes. So the schools and the districts report for all the schools the information to the department, and it is on them. And then there is, I think, conversation across the board in terms of data accuracy and improving that over time, both in terms of the challenge of collecting and reporting, particularly for large schools and districts.
And I think the point you just made, and I see there's a lot, so
Lot of
I'm gonna keep it
questions.
real quick.
Okay.
The complaint point you made,
Mhm.
that this is something you don't need a lawyer, right? Like, this is something that parents have the standing to file, students have the standing to file, educators, community members have the standing to file. And these are complaints that go to our state, and it's real quick, yes or no. Did you follow chapter 222? Did you apply the protections that these families and students deserve? No? These are the steps you're gonna have to take to fix it. Now, one of those things could be one tree falling in the forest, but if we as a community are up on these things together and are working together, right? These are things that can be corralled, if you will, to be one of the districts that you guys are paying more attention to. And more importantly, they are one of the schools that we can leverage that sort of power with. In the instance that you've seen where students are being sent out of the room, right? What we know about chapter 222, one of the end arounds we were worried about was that, right? Was that instead of getting the formal suspension, you get something far less formal that wouldn't even make the books, right? And so what the law says is, look, it doesn't count as an in-school suspension or an out-of-school suspension if it's for less than half a day, unless it's a repeated occurrence. And so if we have schools or students or groups of students who get that, when other students don't, that's a concern that now our State Department of Education has flagged as a violation of this law. So these are the things that we can be vigilant about from the different places that we come to this work in.
Middle microphone. I think you were there first.
Yes, bonsoir.
Wow.
So in expansion of the school to prison pipeline, earlier where you mentioned the cradle to prison pipeline and families who come from families of non-white families have questions about what they can do to support their students and their sons and daughters who are in school. So my question is, how can non-white families, parents, and single parents participate in reforming the school discipline policy and combating the school to prison pipeline?
Okay. Both of you want to answer. Why don't you
start? I'll go to the-
Will, you go
Well,
first.
there's a number that Matt just mentioned that in order for even to understand, we need to do a better job at bringing this information and knowledge to our communities and families. And to do that, we have to also do it in a culturally competent way. The problem we have is, and I ran a campaign of proficiency where I'm trying to align the families, the community, the schools, the parents, all together align in parallel to develop a child. But in order for all of them to work together, they need to respect each other. And they need to say that I need to empower that parent and family to be able to engage me as a teacher, because the parent can help the teacher in the support when they go home. They don't need to know the material. They just need to create an environment of learning at home rather than distracting them with la novela or distracting them with taking care of other children. They're taking care of their own siblings because parents are working, and immigrant families in particular, they're working all the time. All you have to do is create that environment at home. But we have to do a better job, those who know and have this knowledge, to get it out to our community so they know how to activate their voices. But if the school system does not respect parents and puts them to, hey, do a fundraiser for me, let's do a bake sale so you can bring, but they also believe in the independence of the high schooler, but not believe in parent, really a family who wants to still be engaged with their children. Our own system develops the barriers that impedes our own family and community from engaging with them. So the family has to believe that their school is doing right by their child, but they also need the voice of that family to be able to speak on behalf of their child and deal with those limitations. So it's a matter of engaging everybody in this work with that one child, but they also have to do a better job at advocating. We all have to do a better job at informing our community of what their rights are and how to activate them and how to also give them that audience within the school so the school can work in tandem with the family on that development. And they have to be culturally responsive about that and sensitive. Like I said, a greeting can matter a lot. And with immigrant communities, you're not going to get parents to come in on discipline or suspension. Believe me, I work with my Latino community. I got more calls when Trump put out the ban around support and fear that they were going to be they were going to be reported by the teachers or by the schools around their status. And children are doing translation for their own parents as well. So there's other things, challenges that families have that disengage them from the school, and the school wants to engage them, but we need to do a better job at connecting those things and understanding the realities that these families face.
Your advice to parents.
So, I mean, this is the beauty of the work, right? Is that everything that we're struggling with here in Massachusetts or here in Boston is what people are dealing with in Philadelphia and Chicago and Los Angeles. And so we can look to each other for common solutions. So in Chicago to start, a parent organizing group called Power Pack set up the restorative justice that Russ talked about. They set up centers within the schools in partnership with Chicago Public Schools, such that community members, parents, when they had an off day, or grandparents who were already retired, would come to the school and occupy this room and would receive the same training that the educators would around the principles of restorative justice and how to conduct this conference. So when there was something that flared up at school between students, instead of being sent home, they were sent to this room, right? With adults that they could connect with, that they would not necessarily have immediate baggage with because it was the same adult who kicked them out and said, I'm going to suspend you or any of that. right? And that was one very real way that parents became a part of that community and added to the connectivity that those students deserved, right? In Los Angeles, a parent organizing group named Cadre worked on all sorts of disciplinary policy reforms, but when it was clear that it wasn't happening in their district, the parents organized around a set of principles, a checklist, a process by which they toured each of the schools in their district to see whether and how their schools were implementing positive behavior supports. One of the practices that Russ mentioned. And when it was clear that their school was making those efforts, they could see the signs internally, externally, qualitatively, quantitatively. They shined the light on that. But they also called out the schools in their district who put those books on the shelf as soon as professional development was over. And that was a way that parents could monitor and be a part of the system. In Massachusetts, we have a law that says we have to. It says that our school districts, when they analyze and review the discipline code of conduct, which they're required to do each year, they have to engage parents in doing that. So if you want to do it, you say, this is what I'm volunteering for. And if they say that you can't, please give me a call.
The woman on the right. Can't really hear you too well.
Yeah.
Oh, there we go.
I'm concerned about our students who experience trauma and the likelihood that exclusionary discipline will be used for them disproportionately, and also that the impacts on them will be disproportionate in that they won't just be educational, but they may impact students' ability to get a meal or to be in a safe space for 8 hours or 6 hours a day. And I was wondering if you could speak to that.
Speak to it.
What do we know about kids and trauma and discipline?
It's a very important point because, again, when I mentioned the impact, it not only traumatizes the child, but also traumatizes the family. There are a number of groups, in particular my juvenile justice area, that work with traumatized children. You can't avoid the issue of violence when we talk about juvenile justice because most of that comes. So we talk a lot about the PTSD, that's affected by many issues. Because once you push them out, you roll them out into the streets. They again get exposed to the communities. The schools are the safe havens in many cases. We created them to be the hub of the center of safety. And yet they themselves become somewhat that exposure. You know, you have Harper High in Chicago, which had 24 shootings in 1 year, 5 were fatalities. And so one is training the people that are going to be going to the schools, especially now there's a lot of effort on trauma-informed practices. So even when you're training professionals to work with traumatized children, they have their systems, including in our educational system, higher ed, they're looking at trauma-informed practices. They're combining efforts with the behavioral science community, with the mental health communities, the nonprofits. Boston is very resource rich, so we're fortunate to have certain things that focus on particular that. But when you combine violence with a public health issue, it becomes essential to the community to focus on intervention strategies. And there are schools in Boston that I know that have psychologists, social workers, clinicians working with these kids. This is what we call the wraparound school, right? The one that understands that many of these young people come in with trauma already, being exposed to violence and being exposed to many things that happen in families. Going in with traumatized and also coming out of schools traumatized as well. And some of these issues around discipline is also a reinforcement in this sort of internalized anger that they may have. So you might discipline, they may think they're being punished, so they're reacting, and that's a symptomatic to the trauma that they've suffered around their exposure. But there are a number of many organizations in Boston in particular. The Justice Resource Institute has a trauma response team that goes when there's a violence, like a child shot or a person that dies because of violence, a young child. They go out there and work with the schools, work with the parents, work with the residents, work with the kids, just to get them into the mindset that let's step back for a moment and reflect. So there are a number of strategies, but I'm glad to see now that the literature and the research is showing that there's more focus on this trauma as being the center of our approach to really improving a young child's health as well as academic achievement. Because you take the trauma out of the mental health issues, we don't address them well. And especially you have the IDEA, which also focuses in the Rehab Act, which also mandates that we
Mandates, that's
definitely
right.
intervene,
Mandates.
you know, both legally because statutory, we're supposed to be responsible for that. And we have an agency like DCF that handles many of those cases as well. So there's a combination of agencies. The problem for me is that it's access to that information that really people need. Because you could have it, you could have all the resources, you could be resource rich, but it never gets to where it needs to get to. So we need to do a better job at getting it there because we have a lot of people, professionals intervening on that app. And there's a lot of literature also that I would sway people to do that. And also the Department of Education does a good job with working interagency around these issues that are affecting kids. So they're actually partnering in a cross sector because it's not just it's the school's issue, it's the family's issue, it's Department of Mental Health. So there's a combination of resources out there available for that, so.
Okay. Question in the middle.
Yes, thank you for the presentation. I've heard some really inspiring initiatives. Professor Skiba, in your work, two things that stood out were the disproportionate disciplining of Black students and how even when controlling all the other variables, they are still disproportionately disciplined. The other thing that stood out was the difficulty in having conversations about race. So my question for the panel is what is being done in each of your fields to address head-on the issue of race, specifically anti-Blackness, negative stereotypes, and white privilege?
Yeah.
Okay.
I can start.
Yes.
I can start. I hope others will jump in. I think that's a really critical piece. You know, we focus on, and rightly so, we've focused on the tragedies of all of those young people who have been killed on the street in police encounters, and those things are incredibly tragic. But if we look into our schools, there are thousands and thousands of kids who are being exposed to the more subtle issues of disproportionality and discipline, and that obviously affect their lives in both the short term and the long term. One of the things that we did in Indiana that we just wrapped up a project, and it's actually still going on in to some extent, is called culturally responsive positive behavior supports. And what we did was we piggybacked onto a regular implementation of positive behavior interventions and supports, and brought in data showing that there were racial disparities, so that the PBIS team could begin to look at those as well. And it's very interesting talk about issues of race. One of the first schools we brought this data to, the principal came right out and said, you know, when you present this data to me, I feel like you're calling me a racist. And, you know, that really is it captures an awful lot there, because there's that fear of talking about race, because if we talk about the data, that means I or my institution is racist. And since I can't be racist and my institution can't be racist, therefore I have to sort of deny it or put it down, push it down, or move on to something more comfortable to talk about, like socioeconomic status. We need to think about, you know, and I have a colleague who has talked about this issue in terms of like the bimodal term of the use of the term racist. It's either you are racist or you're not racist, and none of us want to be racist, so we're going to go pretty far to avoid having that conversation because we don't want to be racist. But if we think in terms of cultural responsiveness, that's something, it's a skill. It's a learned skill that anyone can have, and we all need to improve on cultural responsiveness. And so we moved we moved the bar a little bit by terming this culturally responsive PBIS and continuing the conversation. And I think one of the things that's important here that is a little bit of a drawback, and something we have to figure out how to deal with, is getting in trained facilitators who will actually point out the issues of race and hold the the team to that. We found
Accountable.
that unfortunately, sometimes if it wasn't our facilitators, the team wouldn't necessarily know how to have those difficult conversations about race. So we need to be doing two things. We need to be ensuring that our teams disaggregate their data and look at that disaggregated data, not because it's possible to look at your data as a whole and say, God, we're making great progress. We're suspending 20% less kids, but we're still suspending the same number or even a higher number of African-American students, but we've got this 20% decrease because our white students have benefited. So we need to make sure that data is disaggregated first. And then second, that we need to have someone there who's a champion on that team who can say, we need to be sure that we are having these discussions about disproportionality. We're not just going on to the easy conversations about, well, not easy conversations, but easier conversations about poverty or about the deficits that the kids are having, but we really need to have this conversation about race as well. So I think the good news was we started that with culturally responsive PBIS. I think the challenge is to make sure that that continues over time and becomes integrated within the team.
I just wanted to add on that. This is one of the most, I'm glad that question came about because that's always a struggle. I've been doing this work for a long, long time. I work with many, many different communities, and I work in a system that's, I consider, the most racist system in this country. I mean, the results of racism has produced the racial and ethnic disparities we have in our criminal justice system. So we punish, again, we go back to this psychology around punishment, penalizing and putting people in jail cells because they look a certain different way, because they are of a certain different race. So we created that social construct. If you ask a Latino person how they struggle with racism, race becomes a reality to them when they come into this country because we often identify with it. We have our biasness. We have our own little racist nature to be, but that's learned behavior. So for me, we create this sort of phobia around what we don't understand and what we don't know. And I think this issue is dynamic around power and control, right? This issue of privilege and non-privilege. And there's this new terminology called implicit biasness. So I go back to your point on super predator. We discussed that in my classroom. And by the way, Wheelock, which has a tremendous diversity, I love my classrooms, it's very diverse. We struggle with this notion of race every day. We struggle with the notion of white students being feeling uncomfortable talking about race because they don't feel safe in that space to say something because the students of color will bring them and put them on notice. And then the student of color also impedes their own voice because they're going to be construed as, oh, you use the race card a lot. So there's a lot of misinterpretations and a lot of use of what we find are deferring to the easiest how to address this problem by running away from it rather than allowing ourselves to be honest and genuine about feeling a little vulnerable, that you're going to have to be vulnerable and allow yourselves to say, hey, you know what? I've had these biases before. Tell me how I can change it. Educate me on both ends. Let's educate each other of how to grow together because I'm sensitive to you because I treat you as a human being. It's about humanity and human relationships. And we're using semantics and words to put ourselves compartmentalized what restricts us to have an honest dialogue about what are our limitations of ourselves, to not understand and be patient, to really listen to all these nuances and idiosyncrasies that make a distinction between whether you are being prejudiced or not. And we need to really have, and I have this with my students, and I say, I put myself out there. Educate me to understand a little bit more about yourself. Now, like I said, I'm Puerto Rican. I don't expect that we lump everybody in, that Latinos will think all the same because you're under the Latino Confederation, that that's one person, one profile, one shape, one size, one way of thinking, and that's not true. I can't say honestly and be honest and be genuine about talking about Hondurans or Guatemaltecos or Nicaraguenses or Cubanos or Dominicanos. We all deal with different lifestyles, but we have one thing in common. Don't mess around with our language because that's our identity first. And we have one thing that unifies us is this commonality around family. And we could talk all about family in all our different ways of doing it. And that can start a conversation. But we get so uptight because the super predator started by author and researchers. And one of them was my professor, who said that they could predict 10 years down the road, we're going to have Black kids and ethnic kids. We're going to be super predator and going to cost people and instill this fear that created the mandatories, that created the zero tolerance, that created this infusing mentality in our schools to not be patient with young people's behavior. So for me, it's all has this really pernicious destructive. We need to step back and say, how do we feel comfortable talking about this issue of race? Why don't we put it out on the table? I'd rather be in the South because at least they're honest to your face and tell you you're a Yankee, you're Black, you're this, you're that. Rather than the Northeast subtleties where we have these kinds of implicit biasness that translate into policies and decisions that are destructive because you're of a different race or ethnicity. So that's the way I look at this issue. And I'm not afraid to talk about it. I'm gonna have my limitations. So sorry,
Let's have Rochelle just talk. How's the department looking at this big, this big question?
It is a big question. It's a very big question. I think that one thing is like around implicit bias. I think a number of schools and districts are trying to take on this work around let's dig deeper into how much is implicit bias playing a role in the discipline practices. And so in looking at the category 18, the nonviolent, non-drug, non-criminal related offenses that do have a lot more subjectivity to it. So when there are sort of disciplines or suspensions related to disrespect or insubordination, for example, for schools and communities to really take on thinking about what interpretation might be brought to bear in this context, and how might teachers or other staff be contributing to a situation. And I think that leadership in schools and districts plays a pivotal role in the degree to which there can be honest conversations and reflection and changes in practice, leading by example, as well as facilitating structured conversations and trainings on an ongoing basis. And I'll conclude just by saying that the data that is very disturbing and compelling can have a helpful side in presenting some information that really can't be ignored, that really requires that schools and districts sort of take a good look at what is behind this data and what can we do about it.
Okay. This gentleman's been waiting for a long time.
It's been perfect because I keep changing my whole conception here. So I'm your northern neighbor from New Hampshire. Diversity exists, but not as much. Although, well, yeah. So I think where I struggle with all this is schools are one entity, and we're a very small part of a larger society.
Right.
In the language, in the sort of belief systems that come out of our larger society, come from our leaders, come from people in positions of higher power than me and educators, don't really help your cause and don't always help our cause as educators. And yet the force of expectations almost always come down on schools and on educators. You need to do X, Y, and Z. You need to curb bullying. You need to address racism. You need to address the attacks on Muslims in our society. These are all things that have happened this year where I am. We need more help from a wider section of society than just us.
Yes,
so
you need
I'm
direction
wondering
is
from
what you
your
need.
positions, how can we not be the problem and the sole solution, but how can we all come together to work towards a societal solution?
Okay. All right. How do we get community involvement?
And so they did this thing to us. You see that?
Right. We only have time for 2 or 3 more questions.
But these people are standing strong. So
Okay.
I'm
Well,
not worried.
so let's try to be as concise as we can. be.
Concise as possible, right? Agreed, right? We're in this point where we have deprofessionalized being an educator, right? To the point that if you are dramatically underfunding Boston Public Schools because you are also dramatically underfunding an outdated funding formula as a state, and you're doing this to Chelsea, and you're doing this to Springfield, and you're doing this elsewhere, and then you couple that by after starving it, right? Using some draconian school takeover model where you fire the teachers and they have to apply for their jobs back. You sure don't build supporters in this work, right? If we're looking at it, just like you said, right? We look at our schools as though this is our moral high ground. This is where we have the opportunity to cure all of our societal ills. But we as a nation, we as a culture, cannot find common words or ability or sometimes even language to talk about race, racial difference, and racial discrimination. Right? And so there's a tremendous chasm between those 2 points. And so my prayer in this work is that we have educators who approach this work from the opinion of we take them as they come. We take our students as they come. We take our families as they come, and we become a part of that community. And then it's on us, and it's on our communities to find ways to end that deprofessionalization of this profession and the things that have happened to cut this down. Which is why we've been fighting on the funding front. Which is why we've been trying to put together toolkits for parents and educators and students around how they can change these disciplinary practices together in their schools. These things are all coming to a head while all of a sudden there's a Trump administration in Washington, right? Like just a minute ago, we were talking about, a post-racial society. Is that possible, right? Like we talked about implicit bias. We don't have to worry about talking about implicit bias anymore if people didn't think racism exists, right? Like these are the times when it's going to come to all of us as communities to band together if we want to be communities and stand up together in support of each other. And we have to support our schools in doing that work.
I just want, just real concise, I'd say pressure on institutions of higher education. As one of our, as you pointed out, our teachers are just not well enough trained in what they need to know in order to be able to manage on a day-to-day basis disruptive behavior in the classroom. I had a colleague, I was at an event surrounding school discipline, and this colleague said, well, all teachers need to know is to have a good pace in their classroom. If they teach well enough, they're not going to have any behavior problems. Oh. Honest to God, this person said this to me. So there needs to be, I go to meetings of the teacher training committee, and I am pushing for us to have, we have a behavior management class at the secondary level, but we don't have one at the elementary level. And I'm pushing all the time on this. I would love to see pressure from the community put on our institutions of higher education to say our teachers need more and better training. All we have to do is look at survey after survey after survey of teachers on what are the places that they felt most unprepared about. And I guarantee you, it's always classroom behavior management as 1 or 2. So please come to us in higher education and tell us we have to do that, because that's something that our teachers need more support in right from the get-go.
And demand it. You're a consumer.
Middle Mike.
Thanks, but
Step up just a little
sure,
bit.
thanks. But in the interest of time, I'll actually check my white privilege and defer to the questioner over here at the right. But I hope you all come see me at the bar after, all right? Because I really want to talk.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you so much. I am standing in the gap for higher education. I am an associate professor at Sage College in Troy, New York, and I am a proud teacher educator. And I just want to make a comment just saying first, I appreciate the conversation. It's been extremely enlightening. I want to just say that oftentimes when you are one of the only faculty of color, and here you are championing the issues of race and equity, it is a very lonely position. I would say that.
I hear you, sister.
Very lonely.
Sometimes, although I have a privilege of having colleagues of color in my institution, so I do have some support there.
Well, it's challenging, and one of the things that I will say, just to address the idea of what's happening in higher education, is this a constant conversation that I'm having with my own colleagues about how they are even presenting information to their candidates and how they are including issues around culturally responsive instruction. But I must say that many of my colleagues are a bit oblivious to those ideas. So I'm always sharing research and sharing articles and sharing videos and all kinds of clips. And now I'm become like this sort of, almost kind of strange person, but I'm okay with that because I realize that our candidates need to know this. One of the things I just want to make as a comment is that when we are putting our candidates into classrooms to give them fieldwork experiences, many times they're going into classrooms that are perpetuating the same issue that we're discussing here today. So they're not always experiencing teachers who are championing good discipline and sort of alternative methods for sitting the kids out of the classroom. They're seeing the same thing perpetuated. They're seeing the same type of ideas that they experienced when they were third graders. And so they come into my classroom and we're having these discussions and they're like, yeah, we hear you, but that's not what we're seeing in the classroom. So it's this constant sort of cycle where I'm trying, I know there's other colleagues at other universities that are trying, but it's challenging. So while I really appreciate those slides and I was thinking, man, I need to take that, I'm going to use that information in my classroom management course. I just want to put it out there that it's not always as simple as that, because they're not going into environments that are really perpetuating those standards that we want them to see. So they see an example of it. They only hear my voice in their ear and then come to me at the end of their program saying, I don't know what to do. There's nothing happening here. The teacher doesn't even have a classroom management plan. What am I supposed to do? So I think this is an ongoing discussion that we need to continue to have.
So Willie, what do you tell your students?
No,
What's your
it's not
advice?
so much to student, but you brought out, and it also answers the question around the professional development, which we've been talking about. It takes really creativity to create, and I think it's incumbent upon leadership to be creative about the way they handle the professional development of teachers and professional development of professors as well. If you want to learn this, then you have to make sure that that becomes part of the training, official training, mandatory training of professional development. A lot of teachers do professional development. They have days off when my child comes home because they had a professional development day. That should be a moment, whether you're studying about mechanics or the lesson plan or anything, where you put your subtle, integrated, race consciousness, sensitive tool in there, the cultural sensitive tool that you need to subtly teach people, because you could do things in very subtle ways where you have the power and control of that. And that doesn't cost money because it's already in the budget. It's a requirement of professional development. And I think that should be done in ways of subtly teaching this kind of data. Infuse that data as an exercise of development. And what would a teacher do in a classroom like this to deal with behavior modifications or whatever they want to do? But I think you should use the tools you already have, because it does take money to do this. But you have some things that you don't need money for. And education and knowledge, you could do very much in your literature, convert it into the stuff that you require, your conditions in your schools, the rules and policies. You could infuse it, but you have to be a risk taker. You have to be a champion of that. And you have to have the courage and temerity to put it in that language. So, which abides by, that's the way I teach and train. That's the way I put it. And that's the way I do with my students. If I want them to learn something, I put it in the material.
Okay, just briefly, as we don't have very much more time. Yes.
Hi, good evening. Saludos. My name is Ethna Fernandez, and I'm a teacher for the past 10 years, about a stone's throw at the McCormick Middle School. And I wanted to ask a question about some of what's been spoken that forms a very important net. And I want to speak a little bit to the gaps in that and the holes in that net, and ask you a little bit to elaborate on that. If you can indulge me, I know we're short on time on painting a quick picture. I work at a school that has embraced PBIS for the past 6 or 7 years, that has done profoundly meaningful work around restorative justice and principles, that does EWI meetings every single Tuesday, that has counselors and clinicians in Trinity and partnerships, and a principal that rejects suspension as a viable option in most cases, and has all these structural pieces in place that Professor Skiba spoke to. And yet every single day, I walk by it's out of our 450 to 500 kids, there's about every year 2 to 4 kids that this setup just isn't working for. It's just not. And that's despite being in, let's say, the 8th graders, right? Culturally relevant curriculum, circles when they need them, interventions have been tried, teachers that work so hard to keep them and engage them, and teachers that are Nima Vashia, you just mentioned, and so many other people that are teachers of colors, because let's be real, that matters as well. And yet these students, that whatever reason that setup of school is just not, as it's set up currently, is not working for them. And so my question is around these resources and these alternatives and what has been happening. Because as much as I want to hope that that one last circle is going to work for so-and-so, I also have to be real. And as much as I want to say, okay, yes, we brought the numbers down and the McCormick is a success story on how all of these policies are successful for that 99.5% of our kids. I also care because I know those kids and I taught them and I love them. And I just went to a funeral of one of my former students last month. So what are these alternative programs that we have seen to be working as far as re-engaging middle school students? And how can we use some of this research to push for this next level of supports and intervention that we need, so that we're not just addressing that 99.5% that deserve all of these things we've been speaking of, but also that tiny group that needs that next step more.
Okay, what do we do? Russ, do you know about alternatives that might help that population, those kids that maybe just don't fit and need extra help, and what do we do?
So that's good. You hint.
Huh?
I get the hardball here.
Yeah.
Well, I think we have to be realistic and say we need to have a continuum of services. I am not going to be one who's going to sit here and say all of our suspensions and expulsions will immediately go to zero. But we need to consider, that said, we need to continually make sure we have a continuum of services available, that we try and keep as many kids as possible. That 2 to 3 kids that you see, my guess is that you're able to define those kids a lot more clearly once we've shrunk our numbers. If we're using suspension to the tune of 300 or 400 per year, then we're mixing up our kids, and we don't know who are the kids who really are the kids who are really in need versus the kids who are just going through a revolving door. So, I think the fact that you've only got a few of those kids is a testament to the fact that you've worked so hard that you can better identify exactly who those kids are. One of the things that I think that has been very effective in places that are using it is our wraparound programs. And we see in those places where there are wraparound programs, schools shouldn't have to be continually or the only institution responsible for our most severe kids. We need to make sure that burden is shared, and wraparound programs with the community. I would reach out and make contact with juvenile justice, with local mental health, with probation officers, with those other service agencies, to see what we as a community can do about those kids. If we are the only institution that's responsible for those kids, it's just too great a burden. Newport News, Virginia, looked at this issue of the most in need kids, and a school social worker there just started having a brown bag once a week with her colleagues from juvenile justice and probation and the judge's office and mental health. And over time, they developed a system of care that's now one of the strongest in the nation, just from having those weekly meetings where they started saying, where are the gaps? So one of the places I would reach out for would be that type of wraparound program, for sure.
Last question. Do you have a question? No. Okay.
Well, thank you all for being here, and thank you, Professor Rodriguez, because for a moment you kind of floated what sounded like a paradigm shift, which was just rethinking about the use of the word discipline. And I think that kind of just flew around and then flew out of the room. But my concern is that we're not really seriously paying attention to the social and emotional competencies of teachers as part of our professional training and ongoing professional development. And I think whether it's PBIS that my school just committed itself to, even though we haven't gotten around to explaining how or why we decided that Open Circle doesn't work. So whether it's PBIS or Open Circle or Second Step or any other program that comes in a box, the growing research from Castle says that none of these things are going to work unless you really spend time fostering the social emotional competencies of teachers. So I'm curious to hear from many of you, how far do you think we need to go to really focus attention first on what it is we're asking teachers to do, rather than how we ask teachers to ask students to do something else? And please, no lip service.
That's a great point. One is when I was running the Boston campaign of proficiency, a lot of the feedback I was getting from, let's not assume, and I like this idea that let's not put all the weight on teachers. We put enough on that, and many of our advocates out there, the same trauma that a child can suffer, the teacher can take it. And to the previous young lady who's dead, I was looking at her and saying, you don't give up on those kids, but you need to find out, as Dr. Skilla said, what may be other issues that maybe someone else can also get that kid back involved. You don't have to do it yourself. I always tell my students, you're not here to save the children. You're here to build pathways. But I also I'm putting them in a very risky area and profession where they're going to deal with trauma, issues of mental health, family breakup, all these kinds of things. So I can't assume they're going to be well once I send them on their practice and they're coming back to me reporting out when they see violence, when they see a child that they were working with shot to death. So I have to think that they also have to get their mental health, their self-care and all of that. So I think that has to be embedded also in the professional development. We're getting away from a lot of, we want to get the skills in, get the competencies in, make sure they meet their indicators and make sure they perform at the highest of levels. But we're forgetting that in this society, American society is very much traumatized. The way we've been behaving in the last thing, we have to deal with a really deliberate strategic measure to bring about not only social emotional development in our trainings for our teachers and our professionals and who deal with young children who are traumatized, also dealing with our kids, but we also have to build it in a curriculum to develop what does this mean? You know, I'm not going to be worth anything if I don't feel good about myself. I'm not going to feel good. How am I going to feel good about trying to motivate a child to be their role model if I'm not even sincere with my own interests? I feel in despair. But you're not here to save the children and not save the people. You're here to build pathways so they can seize that opportunity. It's a strength-based thinking. It's a positive development thinking. It's a positive adult developmental model. So I go to your point. We need to build not only curriculum, but in our training, but we also need to find the time to give those spaces where you can rest and reflect and see and rate yourself and assess whether you need to take care of yourself better, because we need less stress in our jobs to do a job better by building healthy, productive lives in our children. So I go very much centered to the point, and I'm glad that we could end afterwards,
Yes,
right? Because that is a very critical point, and I'm glad you brought it up because I was thinking about it throughout the whole dynamic of exchange and when we're talking about this work, because this takes a lot of perseverance, discipline, and self-care. So I appreciate it very much. Thank you.
Deborah, can I make two quick points? Two quick points, okay.
Quick.
Very quick. One is, and I want to get back to what Professor Rodriguez said and our last questioner said about alternative use of the word discipline. Actually, what we need to do, I think, is reclaim the true meaning of the word discipline. Discipline comes from the same Latin root as disciple.
That's right.
Which means to teach or to learn. And so what we need to be doing is to tell those around us, our peers, our administrators, our state government, our institutions of higher education, we want to learn how to appropriately discipline, and that is to teach or to learn for our students. The second thing is I want to recognize the state of Massachusetts, and I want to recognize your school in particular, the fact that you are able to identify only 3 or 4 students who need that extra support. It's not a failing of our schools that we can't do that. Schools are never going to be able to manage all of the kids. What I want to do is recognize the state of Massachusetts. I also want to recognize all of the schools and the teachers here who are really working hard to create those changes in our schools. So I'd really like a round of applause for those teachers.
Well, thank you. Thank you all very much. I think we're over time. So thank you. Thank
We
you.
only seem to be over.
Okay.
I have the vestige of a cough, and every time I cough, I see Deborah going. I'm wondering whether we have really reached the end. And as the executive director of ARA, I actually, this is not my favorite part to end conversation in its, in its bloom. And is the person who said he was deferring a question until we all go to the bar, are you still sitting? So, I understand that, and we're gonna do that in a moment, but I think one of the things that you practiced in that moment is exactly what we've been trying to do both in this series and in this conversation. And that is that you took a moment to interact in such a just way. And when we think about discipline, it's really the default. We really need to think not just about students and not just about teachers, but the environments that we create. And this lecture series and these discussion forum have been really for us about creating that kind of environment. So I'm going to meet you at the bar. and I would almost say you should make that last statement, but I do know that that time is short, and we've been privileged to have Russ, kind of kick us off with a riveting lecture, and that will be available in its longer form, as will this video. And Deborah, you really, my coughs aside, did a fabulous job, and Matt and Willie and Rochelle, and really you who have joined with us. I mean, that those joining us virtually couldn't ask their questions, but they can follow us in this and future lectures. But this was really about you. Our aim in this series, and in the second century series that follows, is to continue this kind of engagement. In almost every discussion, there was a moment in which there were questions about justice, what we knew, what data we had, what more rigorous knowledge, qualitative and quantitative, we needed to raise. And there was often a moment of, where is race in this conversation? This happened in 6 convenings. And this is an element that we just need to deal with in a very explicit way in every conversation we have. So I want to thank you. I want to thank you for being with us. Our audience virtually, you will not have that drink at the bar, but good evening, and same time in the fall. Good night.
Now, I want to say one thing. I love being in this living room so much, but I have to say my actual living room is only a mile from here in Dorchester.
All right.
But I brought 300 of these toolkits that we worked out with the Boston Student Advisory Council about not only school discipline rights, but what these alternatives look like in practice and how we can organize around them. Because we were getting questions from students, parents, and educators about how we make this right. So I have 300 of these downstairs, and if you don't take them, I'm going to have to carry them for a mile. And so I need your help in picking up any for yourself or anybody you could use it.
Definitely, I said.
Thank you.
I guess it's over. Okay. We'll end this and share it. Please share it, because it's a public information and we have to turn around what we've created.